Okay, Matthew chapter 23, verse 13. That's when Jesus turns his attention to the scribes and Pharisees. He addresses them directly with his list of denunciations. That's the first of his 7 woes that he declares to them. And I discussed that verse last week. And then the second woe, so the first woe is in 23:13, and the second woe is in 23:15. And you recognize that we've hopped over 14, and we did that because, as most of your translations will indicate, there is no verse 14. It is omitted, and if in those versions that actually printed it will say something like, "Woe to you experts in the law and you Pharisees, hypocrites! You devour widows' property, and as a show you pray long prayers. Therefore you will receive a more severe punishment." Now, most modern translations omit verse 14 because it wasn't part of the original text of Matthew. It seems that it made its way into some later manuscripts, later copies of Matthew, based on Mark chapter 12, verse 40, and Luke chapter 20, verse 47. So that saying that I just read, it is a saying of Christ. He did say it. It's just not part of what Matthew recorded in the Gospel of Matthew. And you see it that's the case because the best and the earliest manuscripts of Matthew do not have that verse. And the manuscripts that do include it, the later manuscripts that do include it, some put it before verse 13 and some put it after verse 13. So that's why it's omitted. So I'm not going to address that. It's not part of, almost certainly not part of the original Gospel of Matthew. Then in chapter 23, verse 15, he says, "Woe to you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you travel about the sea and the land to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him a son of hell twice that of you." Now there's some question about the extent to which first century Jews evangelized Gentiles outside of Palestine. Now some think that their missionary activity, it focused exclusively on traveling to distant synagogues and convincing the God-fearers, those Gentiles who worshiped as Jews, who were affiliated with the synagogues, but who did not go all the way to become full Jewish converts. They did not become proselytes because they didn't want to get circumcised, for one thing. So you have them there, God-fearers, they're called these Gentiles who are joining in Jewish worship, but they are not full Jewish converts. But whether these Jews in the first century restricted their evangelism to those affiliated with the synagogue, to those Gentiles, or whether they went to, full-bore Gentiles, those who were not affiliated or associated with the synagogue, the point of what Jesus is saying is that they were doing them terrible harm. Whoever these Gentiles, these converts, the ones that are making proselytes were, that in converting them, they were doing them terrible harm. By converting Gentiles to Phariseeism, they doomed them. They made them sons of hell because their conversion marked their acceptance of the Pharisees' theology, which included the Pharisees' rejection of Jesus as the Christ. So converting to the Pharisees' brand of Judaism, to do that was to embrace the door to the kingdom being shut in their faces, as he just said in verse 13. That's what they were doing. And the converts were twice the sons of hell as the Pharisees who converted them, in the sense that adult converts to a religion, they often were zealous and blindly loyal to Phariseeism. It was a new, exciting, huge, and costly change for them. And as a result, they often out-Pharisee the Pharisees. See, when they converted to Judaism, when they converted to the Pharisees' particular perspective on Judaism, they would be rabid in defending Pharisaical positions, including the denial of Jesus as the Messiah. And you see that sometimes people who convert, they're just really zealous and down with the theology of the group to which they convert. Now, the word that's translated hell here, where it says, when he becomes one, you make him a son of hell, that word is Gehenna. And that's a Greek word, and that comes from the form of an Aramaic word was Gehinnom. So the Greek word is Gehenna, and this word Aramaic was Gehinnom, which in turn, that Aramaic word came from the Hebrew Gehinnom. And Gehinnom, that was the valley of Hinnom, which is one of the valleys adjacent to Jerusalem. So you have the valley of Hinnom, and then in Aramaic it's Gehinnom, and then you see it's here in Greek, it's Gehenna. And so at one time, human sacrifices were offered in the valley of Hinnom to the god Molech. And you can see that in, for example, 2 Kings 23:10 and Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 31. And Virgil Cruz says in the Evangelical Dictionary of Theology, he says, near where this valley joined the Kidron Valley. So you have the Hinnom Valley and the Kidron Valley running right next to Jerusalem, adjacent to Jerusalem. It says, on the south and east was Topheth, early site of Baal worship, and the abominable practice of sacrifice of children to Molech. And he says, for example, 2 Kings 16:3 and 21:6 for involvement respectively of Ahaz and Manasseh. 2 Kings 23:10 for condemnation of Josiah, the former king. In Jeremiah 7:32 and 19:6 is the prophecy that this place of shame will become the place of punishment by God. So I'm just trying to get you to see this idea. How does this term Gehenna come to be this notion of the place of punishment by God? And he says, because of such associations, by the 1st century BC, Gehenna came to be used metaphorically for the hell of fire, the place of everlasting punishment for the wicked. And so that's that's where that originated. That's why that is called, why Gehenna is understood to be this place of God's punishment. Now, though it's often said, and I've said it myself, it's often said that in Jesus' day, this valley served as a fiery garbage dump for the city of Jerusalem. There's no literary or archaeological evidence supporting that claim. That over here we have this valley, the Hinnom Valley, that was a garbage dump. And that's why it came to be associated with the fires of hell. All right, that's a nice story, but unfortunately there is no literary evidence, no archaeological evidence, and that idea, it appears to have been started by Rabbi David Kimhi in the 13th century, which is pretty late, when he was commenting on Psalm 27. Now, this rebuke would apply to any group that converts people to a faith that locks them out of a relationship with God through Jesus Christ. And there are countless false religions, right? There are countless false religions, some that make no pretense of accepting Jesus as the Messiah, and some that do, that are false religions, you see. So in embracing this kind of false religion that locks one out of a relationship to God through Christ, that is the application here, because that's what these people were doing. And then in 23:16 to 22, Jesus says, "Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated. Fools and blind men! For which is greater, the gold or the temple that has sanctified the gold? And who say, whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing. But whoever swears by the gift upon it is obligated. Blind men! For which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift? So the one who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And the one who swears by the temple swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And the one who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. Now, oath-taking was a prevalent practice that was much abused in the time of Jesus. Voluntary oaths, whereby a person would swear that he would do or would not do some specific thing, they were common in everyday life. But people, they were afraid, in other words, no, will you do this, not do that? Yeah, I'll swear I won't do that, or I'll do that. Right? They did this often, but they were afraid of swearing by the name of God. They didn't want to invoke God's name in an oath where they were saying, yeah, I won't do this or I will do it. They were very fearful of doing that because violating that kind of oath, an oath in which you invoked God's name, that was considered to be profaning the name of God, which they feared would be severely punished. You can see in Exodus chapter 20, verse 7, and 1 Kings 8:31 and 32. So they were afraid of actually using God's name. So rather than swear by God's name, they swore by all kinds of other things that had varying degrees of connection with God. And it's evident, you see, from Matthew chapter 5, verse 34 and 36, that some would swear by heaven, some would swear by earth, some would swear by Jerusalem, some would swear by their own heads. And we see here in 23:16 to 22 that some also swore by the temple, they swore by the altar, they swore by the gold of the temple, and they swore by the gift on the altar. Now the Pharisees, they purported to have an answer. They purported to have the correct understanding of God's will as to which oaths were valid and binding and which were not. These oaths that did not invoke God's name, but used that made reference to things that had varying degrees of connection to God. The Pharisees claimed to know which of those things were valid and binding and which were not. But their so-called answer to which are valid and which are not, it revealed a lack of understanding of God. Right? In less than 4 verses, Jesus calls them blind guides, fools and blind men, and blind men. Right? So this is a clue that they have really missed the boat when he says this to them. Now, to make the validity of an oath hinge on a technicality in wording, when the whole point of the oath was to bolster one's credibility by an albeit indirect appeal to God, it's to think that God puts form over substance. Right? To think that's how it operates. It's like thinking that God won't hold somebody to their oath if they have their fingers crossed when they say it. It's along those lines. That kind of concept of God. You see, it is a mechanical, it is a small-minded, legalistic view of God. In fact, it's an outrageous concept of God. And Jesus exposes the error of trying to force God into that mechanical, legalistic concept, that mold, by showing the foolishness of the distinctions they have drawn. So they say, listen, we have this thing wired. We know these things that are indirectly related to God. We know which of those are valid and binding and which are not. And so he shows the foolishness of their choices, what they're saying, by showing that their distinctions are foolish. Right? It makes no sense to claim that swearing by the lesser, the gold of the temple, the gift on the altar, It makes no sense to claim that swearing by the lesser, that's binding, but swearing by the greater, the temple and the altar that make the gold and the gift sacred, that's not binding, right? And to think that one who swears by the temple, the altar, or by heaven has not sworn by God, well, that's nonsense. That's absolute nonsense. So since the distinctions that they put forward as determinative of the validity of oaths in God's eyes, since those distinctions are illogical, they don't make sense, they clearly do not understand God. And they need to rethink the view of Him that drove them to these kinds of absurd distinctions. They're looking at God as like a cosmic slot machine or something. They have no idea of the right nature of God. And it's instructive, I think, to compare Jesus' handling of the oath question in Matthew chapter 5, verses 33 and 37. He rejects voluntary oath-taking altogether. Right? He rejects that altogether. The Old Testament requirement of keeping one's oath, not swearing falsely. Well, that requirement points to the fundamental importance of truthfulness. And that requirement, you see, it finds its fulfillment in a truthfulness that is so consistent, so regular, that there can be no place for an oath. Right? Since every word of a disciple, every word of a follower of Jesus Christ was to be honest and binding. If I tell you something, I tell you something. Right? Since every word of a disciple was to be honest and binding, there was no place for them to offer sworn speech as distinctively trustworthy. Right? Everything I say is trustworthy. So if I wind up saying, well, I have this to make this really trustworthy, well, then I'm saying that what I normally say is not trustworthy to the same extent as this. But it's all trustworthy because I tell the truth. Because we're disciples of Jesus Christ. Right? So if you do that, if you use an oath, that's an indictment against your own integrity. Because you're saying that there is another level here. Normally you can't trust me. You can only be sure, really sure I'm telling the truth, if I validate that with an oath. That's why Jesus says, that's why He gets rid of voluntary oaths. And that prohibition, I think it's limited to voluntary oaths, because in an official oath, right, one that's required by responsible authorities, one is not swearing, is not offering that sworn testimony as more reliable. You're not saying, here, listen, I'll swear so you'll believe me. Right? In that case, one is simply complying with someone else's requirement for trustworthiness. You see, look, I always tell the truth. But somebody says here, well, you have to do this. All right. See, I'm not saying believe me because I'm swearing. Somebody else has that requirement on me. So I think he's talking about voluntary oaths. Now, if Paul's witness formula, you see Paul employ like 2 Corinthians 1:23 and Galatians chapter 1 verse 20. If that witness formula that he used, if that qualifies as swearing, and it may, if it qualifies as swearing, well, it may be then that love requires that voluntary oaths. Okay, where Jesus says, I'm outlawing voluntary oaths. Well, Paul, if that is an oath, a voluntary oath that he's giving, his witness formula, well, then it may be that voluntary oaths need to be given when skepticism makes them necessary to benefit other people. Okay, so maybe that would be by the Spirit we'd be seeing there's an exception there and say, well, what are you talking about? Well, there's a difference, right, between my swearing to you that my elixir is an antidote to a snake bite to get you to buy my elixir. No, I swear to you, it'll stop that, you see. There's a difference between my making a voluntary oath to get you to do that and my swearing to you that it's an antidote so you will take it before you die. Right? In the one case, I'm trying to overcome your skepticism that you've placed on me so I can bless you. So it may be, see, in a case like that the requirement of love would require me in that case to make a voluntary oath to save your life, because otherwise you won't trust that it's an antidote and I want to save your life. Okay, that's how I would integrate what Paul does if you say that his witness formula qualifies as an oath, whereas the Lord outlawed voluntary oaths. Then I would put them together that way. I would say if that is in fact an oath, then it may be that when the obligation of love requires one to make an oath to bless a skeptic, then it's okay to do it. Okay, that's how I'd put those things together. Now, the anger that Jesus expresses, for certainly in 17, fools, blind men, the anger that he expresses in calling them that, and you can also look in Mark chapter 3, verses 1 to 5, that is different from what Jesus condemns in Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 and 22. Right? He says, don't be angry, don't call people fools. He forbids that. Well, this is different from that, right? It's a righteous indignation. That's the phrase that is often used, and I think it's a good one. It is a righteous indignation that is directed toward sin. It is directed toward a gross misrepresentation and caricature of God that damages the spiritual life of those who are sucked in by it. You see, this is a very harmful, sinful thing. Holiness cannot be indifferent toward sin. You see, somehow in our culture we have this idea that anger towards sin is, no, you can't be. No, see, holiness, you see, can't be indifferent towards sin. It's not noble to yawn at moral outrages. That doesn't make you high-minded and big. If you're looking at the Holocaust, if you're looking at abortion, if you're looking at all of these kinds of moral outrages, and you say, so what? Now, we understand it when we talk about slavery. Right? Do you think it's holy and high-minded? Say, well, slavery, that's no big deal. No. You understand that there's a time to be angry at sin. Right? And that's what Jesus is expressing here. And the reference in 5:21 and 22 is to personal anger, which might explain, by the way, the clarifying addition in some manuscripts of without cause. That's personal anger. That reference is there. See, personal anger as opposed to this moral indignation over sin. Let me read to you what Robertson McQuilkin and Paul Copan say in their Introduction to Biblical Ethics. It says, righteous and unrighteous anger can be distinguished by the cause of anger. One should be angry over sin that offends God, harms others, or harms the person sinning. That's what I was saying. You know, to just sit there and say, I don't care. You know, people raping children, you know, I don't really get worked up over any of that. I'm telling you, that's not holy. That's not noble. You see, he says they say the difficulty with being righteously indignant is that our motives are often mixed. You see, I'm talking conceptually here about righteous indignation, but you and I, in actually living this out, we have to be really careful, right? Because it is a rare thing that we're really righteously indignant. At least I'll speak for myself. I'm more inclined just to be personally angry and sinfully angry. Okay, they go on, they say, difficulty with being righteously indignant is that our motives are often mixed. Am I distressed over a sin that offends God and harms people? Or am I angry over the way I am affected? In the latter case, the safe thing may be to eschew anger altogether, as when my child does wrong, but the wrong embarrasses me. Okay, so now, why am I so worked up over what she did? Is it really that she's done wrong and that's what's stirring, or is it because she made me look bad? You see? She made me look bad. That's the question. Better to wait till the anger subsides to be sure the resulting action does not come from a mixture of righteous and unrighteous indignation. Anger is sinful when it is for the wrong reason or results in wrong action. So here, and I think that's why those are wise words. Now in Matthew 23, verses 23 and 24, Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, yet have neglected the weightier things of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These things it was necessary to do, and those not to neglect. Blind guides! You strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel." As I said, Jesus, this stuff is a 10 on the rebuke scale, right? This is a 10. Now, various passages in the Old Testament address the Jewish obligation of tithing. You see in Leviticus 27, 30 to 33, Numbers 18, Deuteronomy. Now, clearly the Jewish people were required to give a tenth of certain assets for the benefit of Levites. You see in Numbers 18:21, who in turn were then to give a tenth of that tenth for the benefit of the priests. You see in Numbers 18:25 to 28. But there's some uncertainty about the full picture of tithing, about how the various texts relating to tithing, how they were integrated and practiced in first century Judaism. There evidently was a debate in first century Judaism about precisely what assets were included within the tithing obligation related to farming. Craig Keener says, one area of piety for which Pharisees were particularly known was their scrupulousness in tithing. They were really into it. Okay, very serious about it. He said, and they were among those who insisted that the law required even garden herbs. Even garden herbs, not simply field produce, to be included in the tithe. So you have this obligation of tithing, and there's this question with regard to the tithing requirements of farming. Do those requirements extend to garden herbs, or do they only relate to field produce? So that was a question. And the Pharisees said, no, they include the herbs. You got to give a tenth of all of it. Now, Jesus doesn't rebuke the scribes and Pharisees for being concerned over the details of tithing, for trying to be careful in understanding what did God intend when he required us to give a tenth. He doesn't rebuke them for that, and for being careful to give a tenth of even the garden herbs. That's not what he rebukes them for. Rather, he says it was necessary for them to do that, for them to give a tenth of the garden herbs, and he says it was necessary for them to do that either because that was the correct understanding of God's will when he obligated them to give 10%, or because they sincerely believed that was God's will and therefore their conscience would require them to do it. So he says you shouldn't have neglected that, right? You should go ahead and do that, but either for either of those reasons, but he rebukes them. You see, he rebukes them not for their carefulness about tithing, but he rebukes them for neglecting the more important matters of the law. The more important matters of justice, mercy, and faithfulness, while caring so much about the less important matter of the precise extent of the tithing obligation. Perfectly fine to be concerned about the precise extent of the tithing obligation. That's all good. But you cannot do that and then neglect the weightier things of the law. They are hypocrites in this. And I told you how hypocrite in New Testament and in the first century was wider than we commonly understand it. They're hypocrites in this because they're focused on the minutia of tithing. That focus there made them appear to be obsessed with the things of God. Right? I mean, I'm caring about this. I want to make sure I've got absolutely... So that gives off the vibe that makes them appear to be, well, they're really down for God. They're really obsessed with the things of God. But the reality... So the appearance was one thing, the reality was otherwise, as demonstrated by their lack of concern for the more important things of God. They are blind guides because they purport to be spiritual leaders, right? Spiritual guides. So they purport to be spiritual guides, but they do not see the true way of God. That's why they're blind guides. They're focused on the details of tithing while neglecting justice, mercy, and faithfulness. It's like a person who's very careful to strain his wine so as not to mistakenly ingest a ritually unclean gnat. Okay, as you see in Deuteronomy 14:19. But who turns around and swallows a camel? Right? The largest unclean animal in Palestine. You see in Deuteronomy 14:7. Now, and so I mean, it's a beautiful picture, right? I'm so concerned that I might ingest something unclean. I'm straining my wine so to make sure a gnat doesn't get through. But on the other hand, you're gobbling this camel down. Okay, and in fact, in Aramaic, which is almost certainly the language Jesus spoke, the words for gnat and camel are very similar, kalma and galma. So you can see Jesus here with a word play while he's pounding them. Now, God's concern for justice, for mercy, and for faithfulness is a central note of the Old Testament as well as the New. He has always insisted that we treat others fairly, that we be kind and merciful toward them, and that we be faithful in our walk with Him, giving Him the supreme loyalty that He deserves. Jesus may well have had in mind here Micah chapter 6, verse 8, where it says, He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, and to love kindness or mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. So Jesus may have been thinking of that text. See, to be more concerned with the lesser matter of tithing details is inexcusable. It reflects a warped concept of God. You see, you're putting the majors in the wrong place. And you notice that Jesus refers to weightier things, more important things in the will of God. He earlier spoke of lesser commandments and the greatest commandment. And the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is called very grave. You see, distinguishing it in terms of its heinousness. Called very grave in Genesis 18:20. Israel's sin with the golden calf is called great sin in Exodus 32. The sin of Eli's sons is called very great in 1 Samuel 2:17. And the sin of the northern kingdom of Israel under Jeroboam is called great sin. In 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 21, God speaks to Ezekiel of great and greater abominations in Ezekiel 8:5-15. And the Apostle Paul, he left no doubt in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, 1 and 2, that incest in the form of a man having his father's wife was a particularly great offense. He said, look, this is something even the pagans don't go for. Right? Even they don't go for that. A particularly great offense. Now, no aspect of God's will is trivial, right? I hope I don't even have to say that. No aspect of God's will is trivial, but some things are more central. Some things are more important. And the fact that all unforgiven sin will exclude one from eternal life with God does not mean that all sins are equally offensive to God in all respects, that they are all equally bad. That is a myth that has started and you can't stop it. But the idea that all sins are equal, simply because they all result in one's exclusion from God, is not right. Lusting, looking at a woman with lust, that's sinful. Okay, Jesus makes clear that's sinful, but that's a less serious sin than raping her. Right? Hating a brother. Jesus makes clear that's sinful, but that's a less serious sin than chopping him into pieces. Right? Here's what Michael Kruger, New Testament scholar, says. First, to say all sins are the same is to confuse the effect of sin with the heinousness of sin. While all sins are equal in their effect, they separate us from God. They're not all equal. They are not all equally heinous. Second, the Bible differentiates between sins. Some sins are more severe in terms of impact, in terms of culpability, in terms of the judgment warranted. Third, although all people are sinners, the Bible makes clear that some are more holy than others. The Bible has the category of the righteous person who is singled out by God as notably different. He doesn't mean righteous in the sense of sinlessness. We saw that with Job, right? When we just finished studying Job. Job he's sinless. He's a paragon of righteousness. But he's a sinner. But he still is distinctively righteous, because he's more righteous than normal people, right? He goes on, he says, in the end, all sins are the same in their effect, but some sins are different in terms of their heinousness. And I think we sometimes just miss that. And I think it's clear here when he talks about greater sins and the weightier things and that kind of thing. Now, we have to always be on guard. So what do I think? What's the message here from Jesus for us to take away, for us to hear? And we have to always be on guard against allowing a focus on the lesser to blind us as to a failure regarding the greater. Okay? No zeal, just for example, no amount of zeal for the particulars of worship or the particulars of church government, however important those things may be, no amount of zeal for those things can be allowed to narrow our focus to only those things. Right? So that becomes the hobby horse by which we judge everything. No, I'm about this and I've got this right, and that's all I'm going to care about. Well, we can't allow that to happen. We must never lose sight of our fundamental obligation to love people, to serve people, to be gracious, to be charitable, to be forgiving toward people, and to walk humbly with God in every aspect of our lives. Let's keep the former without neglecting the latter, without becoming content with only keeping the former. You see, let's not just narrow our focus, like I say, that we're about these things and then lose sight of other things, other weightier things. 23, I know the bell's going to ring here. I'm 3 minutes. Okay. 23, 25, and 26. Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full from greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee! First clean the inside of the cup, that the outside of it also may be clean." Now, the Pharisees' concern with ritual cleansing of items related to eating That was well known. For example, in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 7, 3 and 4, it says, For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. So they were very concerned about the ritual cleansing of the vessels from which they ate. And when Jesus said earlier in his ministry, in Luke chapter 11, verses 39 to 41, you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and dish. There he was using cup and dish as metaphors as representations of the Pharisees themselves. Okay? He was not talking about their literally washing cups and dishes as part of ritual purification. That's clear from the immediately following clause where he says, but the inside of you, right, is full of greed and wickedness. In other words, in saying that they clean, here in Luke 11, saying that they clean the outside of the cup and dish, he was referring to how they made themselves, the cup and dish standing representing the Pharisees, how they made themselves appear outwardly. They buffed up the exterior, you see, how they appeared pious in the eyes of people, how they appeared religious in the eyes of people, while being corrupt in their hearts, in the inside. Now here in Matthew 23, I think Jesus makes ultimately the same point. He makes the same point, but I think he gets there in a slightly different way. Okay, now this might be a little nerdy, a little particular, but that's just how I think. When I'm working through and thinking about text, I want to know what do the words mean and how are they functioning. Okay? So, as in Luke, he tells the Pharisees, you clean the outside of the cup and dish. He uses a different word for dish, but that's not significant. He says there, you clean the outside of the cup and dish, but instead of saying, but the inside of you is full of greed and wickedness, thereby making clear that the cup and dish represent the Pharisees, as what he says in Luke 11, right? He says here, but they, the cup and dish, are full from greed and self-indulgence. Okay, and the preposition from, the word that's used there, it could be of, and many translations take it that way, but its normal rendering is from, and I think that's what you need to keep here to get how Jesus is getting to the point. But you think I didn't hear that bell, and I did, so thanks for coming.